Wyoming Territory, 1885. The storm came through at midnight, and it was the thunder that did it, not the wind. Clara Bennett woke to the sound of splintering wood and was on her feet and out the door before she'd fully decided to be. The south corral rail had gone down under Comanche's shoulder, and the big copper gelding was already through the gap and running, mane flat against his neck, the whites of his eyes catching what little moonlight made it through the clouds. She did not panic. She was 36 years old, and she had been running this ranch alone for 16 months. And panic was a luxury she had stopped affording herself somewhere around the third week after Daniel didn't come home. She grabbed a lead rope off the fence post and went after the horse in her nightdress and boots, calling his name into wind that took the sound and scattered it before it reached him. Comanche was not an easy horse. He never had been. Daniel had bought him off a drover 2 summers back, a Greenbroke 3-year-old with too much power and not enough trust. And Daniel's answer to that had been a heavier hand than the horse could forgive. Clara remembered the winter Daniel had tried to break him properly. The rope burns on his own palms. The way the gelding's eyes had gone flat and wary rather than wild, which was worse. By the time Daniel left, Comanche would tolerate a halter and little else. He'd flinch at a raised hand from 6 feet off. He'd stand rigid under a saddle blanket like he was waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Clara had spent 16 months trying to undo what her husband had done, and had made only the smallest progress, measured in inches, paid for impatience she didn't always have to spare. Now he was loose in a lightning storm, running blind toward whatever felt like a way, and she was chasing him across the property line into land that had sat empty for 2 years and had apparently sold last month to a stranger nobody in Larkspur had laid eyes on yet. She found him tangled at the new neighbor's fence, a wire loop caught around his near hind leg, thrashing just enough to draw the wire tighter with every attempt to free himself, and a man already crouched beside him in the dark, talking low and even, one hand resting flat on the horse's trembling shoulder like it belonged there. "Don't come at him fast," the man said without turning around. "He's about 2 seconds from putting a hoof through somebody, and I'd rather it wasn't either of us. That's my horse." She stopped where she was, breathing hard, rain running off her in sheets. "I gathered." He didn't look up. His voice stayed low, steady, aimed at the animal rather than at her. The same even tone whether he was talking to the horse or to her, like he didn't believe in raising it for either. "He's caught, not hurt, far as I can tell in this light. Wire's loose enough I can work it free if he'll hold still a minute longer. Fighting it just draws it tighter." She stood where she was, soaked through, and watched a stranger do in 90 seconds what she had failed to do in 16 months. Comanche's ears, pinned flat since she'd left the house, came forward, then swiveled, listening to a voice that asked nothing of him. His breathing slowed. His weight came off his hindquarters, settling. The man freed the wire without ever raising his voice above a murmur, working the loop free strand by strand with a patience that seemed to cost him nothing at all, and the horse let him. "Wade Calloway," he said, straightening up slowly. No sudden movements, hands still open and visible to the horse. "Moved onto the old Henderson place 3 days back. Didn't expect to meet the neighbors quite this way. Clara Bennett." She looked at Comanche, who was standing quietly beside a man he had known for 2 minutes, something he had not done for her in a year and a half. Not once, not even on the good days. It stung more than she expected. "That's my fence he came through, and apparently my horse he prefers." "He doesn't prefer me." Wade ran a hand down the gelding's neck, checking the leg where the wire had been, unhurried. "He's just tired of being handled like he's dangerous. Most horses that fight a rope aren't mean. They're scared, and somebody taught them scared and dangerous look the same from the ground. Once a horse learns that lesson, it takes a long while to unlearn it, and it never unlearns it from the person who taught it. Has to be somebody new." She had no answer for that, not one she wanted to say out loud to a stranger in the rain. She led Comanche home through the last of the storm, and the horse walked beside her the whole way with none of the resistance he usually offered. And she thought about the way the stranger's hand had rested on his shoulder like weight he already knew how to carry, and about how long it had been since anything on this ranch had gone easy. What she learned from Doris at the Mercantile over the following week, delivered in the particular tone of a woman who considers new arrivals a civic responsibility to investigate, was that Wade Calloway had ridden as a Texas Ranger for 12 years before he wasn't one anymore. that he'd paid cash for the Henderson place without so much as haggling, and that he'd come north with 2 horses, a wagon of tools, and the particular quiet of a man who has spent a long time chasing something and has finally stopped to see what's still standing when he holds. Still, he was 44. His eyes carried more years than that, Doris said, like he'd been rained on somewhere and never quite dried out. He did not fill silence with anything, and he said only what was true and left the rest where it lay, which unsettled some people in town and did not unsettle Clara nearly as much as she expected it to. 3 days after the storm, he came by to check her corral rail, the one Comanche had broken through, and found the whole south section weaker than she'd realized. He fixed it without being asked, reset 2 more posts besides, and left before she could properly thank him. The way a man does work he doesn't consider owed anything in return for. Clara found this either presumptuous or a relief, and had not yet settled on which, and found herself, a day later, still thinking about it. It was 2 weeks after that when she asked him the thing that changed everything. She'd walked to the fence line at dusk, found him there mending a gate hinge with the unhurried competence she was starting to expect from him, and said it plainly because she'd rehearsed it plainly all afternoon, turning the words over while she did chores, and saw no reason to dress them up now that the moment had come. I need Comanche rideable by autumn. I can't run this place with a horse I can only lead, and I can't afford to hire it done. And you're the only man in the county he stood still for since my husband bought him. She looked at him, made herself hold his eyes instead of the hinge in his hands. Will you ride him for me? Wade set down the hinge. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't measuring her, but the request, turning it over the way she'd turned over the words. That's not a small thing you're asking. I know what I'm asking. You're asking me to spend weeks earning trust off an animal that's had it broken once already by somebody he lived with every day. It won't go fast. It won't go easy. There'll be days it looks like it's not going anywhere at all. And there's no guarantee at the end of it he lets me put a saddle on him, let alone lets anyone ride him. I know that too. She held his eyes, made herself say the rest of it even though it cost her something. I've watched what you did with the wire in the dark. I trust your hands more than mine right now with this particular animal. That's not a comfortable thing to admit about my own horse, but it's true. And I'd rather be honest about it than pretend otherwise and waste both our time. Something shifted behind his face, not quite a smile, but the ground a smile grows from, the first sign of it she'd seen. All right, he said. I'll ride him, but you're going to be there for it. Every session, every evening, rain or shine. He needs to learn to trust both of us, not just me, or all I've done is transfer the problem from your hands to mine, and you'll be right back where you started the day I move on to something else. Fair enough, she said, and put out her hand, and he shook it like they'd struck a contract, which in a way they had. Before we go any further, I want to ask something of you listening tonight. Wherever you are right now, driving home, folding laundry, sitting up with something that won't let you sleep. This story is for the in-between hours, the ones that don't get talked about much. If Clara and Wade are keeping you company tonight, leave that story a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone. Now let's get back to that round pen, because 6 weeks is a long time to change a horse's mind, and it changed more than the horses. It took him 6 weeks. 6 weeks of evening sessions in her round pen, Wade moving at the pace of a man with nowhere else he needed to be, teaching the horse first to be touched without flinching. A hand on the shoulder, held there until the muscle under it stopped bunching. Then to accept a blanket laid across his back and lifted away a dozen times before it stayed. Then a saddle set on light as a whisper and cinched loose enough that the horse forgot it was there. Then, on a cold morning in late September with Clara standing at the rail holding her breath so hard her chest ached, his own weight in the stirrup and finally astride. There had been setbacks along the way. The second week, a saddle blanket slipping had sent Comanche into a spinning, snorting fit that put Wade flat on his back in the dirt, and he'd gotten up slower than he wanted her to notice, dusted himself off, and gone right back to the fence rail to start again, quieter than before rather than more forceful. That's the mistake people make, he told her that evening, working a knot out of his shoulder. They think a setback means start harder. It means start smaller. Go back to the last thing he trusted and build from there again, slower this time. The fourth week, Comanche had let her, not Wade, her, run a hand down his foreleg for the first time since Daniel had left. And she'd had to turn away so Wade wouldn't see her face. Comanche stood like he'd been doing it his whole life the morning Wade finally sat astride him. "Well," Wade said, looking down at her from the horse's back, something easy in his face she hadn't seen there before, an easiness that seemed to surprise him as much as her. "He's yours now properly. Ride him tomorrow. He'll take you the same as he's taking me." "He's not going to throw me?" "He might have thrown you 6 weeks ago. Not now. Now he knows what a person on his back is supposed to feel like, and he knows it doesn't have to be the way it used to be." He swung down and handed her the reins, careful, like he was handing over something more than leather. "That's the whole trick of it, Clara. It was never about breaking him. It was about giving him a reason to believe a person could be trusted with the weight. Same trick as anything, I expect." She rode Comanche the next morning across her own land for the first time since Daniel bought him. Out past the north pasture and back, the gelding carrying her like he'd always meant to, ears forward the whole way instead of pinned. And she understood, riding him, that Wade had done something to both of them that went deeper than horsemanship, something she didn't have words for yet and wasn't in any hurry to find them. Autumn brought the numbers due, and Clara had been managing them since July with the particular dread of a woman who does arithmetic every night hoping it will change. And it never did, not by so much as $1. Daniel had left her the ranch, generous in principle and complicated in practice. 200 acres, 50 head of cattle, a workable spread if she'd had 2 more hands and better luck, and a note for $160 owed to Silas Crane, who ran his lending business out of the back of the feed store and had told her plainly in July that he expected payment by the 1st of December, not a day later, and had said it in the tone of a man who enjoyed being the one saying it. The autumn cattle sale, 4 weeks off, was her only real chance at it, and the local Larkspur market had been sliding for a month, flooded with drought-thin stock from every ranch in the county. Every rancher trying to sell before the next man undercut him further. She hadn't told anyone. She'd done the sums alone at her kitchen table by lamplight, over and over, hoping a different answer might turn up if she just checked one more time. And it never did. Wade found out from Crane himself, who mentioned it at the feed store with the loose tongue of a man who considers other people's debts public conversation, and good business besides. And Wade rode over that evening and told her he knew before she had to find out he'd learned it secondhand. He had no right, she said, feeling the old flush of shame rise before she could stop it. "No," Wade agreed. "He didn't, and I told him so, for whatever that was worth to him." He leaned on her fence rail, and for a moment neither of them said anything more. And she was grateful he let the silence sit instead of rushing to fill it with reassurance she didn't want. The Union Pacific Spur reached the territory last year. Changed the cattle market completely for anyone who can reach it. I've got a contact, an agent named Doyle, buying beef for the rail camps in the eastern lines. He doesn't touch the local pool prices. Pays considerably better, and pays in coin, not credit against next season. I'm not asking for charity. I know you're not. I wouldn't offer it if you were, and you wouldn't take it if I did. I've known you 2 months, and I know that much already. The almost smile again. This is business. My herd's going in the same sale regardless of yours. Better prices help us both. And combining the drive means 2 riders managing 90 head instead of 1 managing 45 alone, which is safer for everybody, including the cattle. She thought of the 6 weeks in the round pen, of a stranger who had given her back a horse she'd thought she'd lost the use of for good, and found she believed him more easily than she'd believed anyone in a long while. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They drove the combined herds to the rail depot at Larkspur together that October, 90 head instead of 45, with Otis from the livery riding along as the third hand for a share of the proceeds, and Comanche under her for the first time on a real drive, steady beneath her the whole way, answering to her leg and her voice the way he'd learned to answer to Wade's. No difference between them now that mattered to the horse. The first day went easy, the herd settled, the weather holding. The storm caught them on the second, 12 miles out, dropping the temperature 15 degrees inside an hour and putting a wind through the herd that made the cattle nervous in that particular way. That comes before real trouble. A current running through 90 animals like something passed between them without a sound. Clara saw the lead steer start to shift before Wade did. A subtle restlessness, 3 animals breaking rhythm with the rest. The tell she'd learned to watch for on drives with Daniel years back, before any of this had gone wrong. "They'll bolt left if this wind keeps building," she said. "We push through," Wade said, watching the sky go the color of a bruise. "Stop now and we lose the light, and the weather only gets worse overnight, and we're caught out here regardless. The front needs 2 riders, not 1, not in this. Ride to the rear with Otis, keep them bunched from behind. I'll hold the front, Wade." She kept her voice level, the way he kept his. "I can read what's coming in this herd. You don't know them like I do. You've had them 2 days. I've had them 3 years." He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Some old instinct arguing with what she'd just told him, and whatever it cost him to set the old instinct aside, he set it aside. And she watched him do it, watched the decision cross his face and settle. "All right," he said. "Take the left front. I'll hold the right. Otis, you're the rear. Keep them tight." When the wind hit and the lead cattle surged 20 minutes later, she was already moving, cutting the angle with Comanche under her like the horse had been born knowing this ground rather than having learned to trust a saddle 6 weeks prior. And between the 2 of them and Otis at the rear, they lost nothing. Not one head, not one calf separated in the confusion, which on a drive like this was as close to a miracle as weather allowed. The storm passed within the half hour. The depot came into view in the gray afternoon light, and the herd walked into Larkspur intact, steaming in the cold, exhausted and whole. "How long's he been under saddle?" Wade asked, riding up beside her, nodding at Comanche, whose sides were heaving but whose ears were still forward, still listening. 6 weeks. You'd know better than I would." He almost smiled, the expression she'd started cataloging without meaning to, filing away each occurrence like a woman keeping count of something she wasn't ready to name. "You handled that front like you'd been doing it for years." "I have, just not on this horse." She looked at him, the rein drying stiff in his collar, his hands still steady on the reins after all of it. "You were watching the right the whole time, weren't you? Not just the cattle, you kept glancing over." "Some," he admitted, and didn't pretend otherwise. Doyle paid a price the Larkspur buyers couldn't match and didn't try to, precise and businesslike about it. Took 40 head between the 2 herds, and covered Crane's note with $40 left over besides. More breathing room than Clara had allowed herself to hope for back in July. Clara stood on the depot platform afterward, and let herself believe, just for a moment, standing in the noise and bustle of a rail town that had no idea what the sum meant to her, that the winter was hers and the ranch was going to hold through it. Wade came out of the agent's office and stood beside her without a word. The 2 of them looking out at Larkspur doing what a rail town does on a market day, busy and loud and entirely indifferent to the fact that a woman had just saved her land with a horse nobody could ride 2 months before. "Thank you," she said, "for Doyle, for all of it really. I don't know that I've said that plainly enough." "Doyle paid for cattle he wanted at a fair price," Wade said. "That's not charity either." "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway. Some things are worth saying twice." He looked at her, not the sideways glance from the trail, the direct one, the one she'd started receiving more often lately and had never quite gotten used to. "You rode that front alone in a storm on a horse that couldn't be touched 2 months ago. You were on the right. I know where I was. I also know what I almost did." He looked at his boots, and for the first time since she'd met him, he seemed uncertain how to say the next part. "I almost sent you to the rear to keep you clear of the dangerous half. Told myself it was sense. It wasn't, not really." He was quiet a moment, the noise of the depot going on around them. "My wife, Eleanor. She died 2 years back, thrown from a wagon on a road I was supposed to be riding with her, and I was 3 counties off on ranger business instead, chasing a man who turned out not to be worth the chasing. I've spent 2 years since trying to fix that by keeping people at arm's length from anything that might hurt them. Like if I just managed the risk hard enough for everybody around me, it evens some old score. It doesn't fix anything. It just keeps me useless to the people who don't need managing. They need trusting. He met her eyes. You're not someone who needs to be kept away from things, Clara. I knew that, and I still near did it anyway, out of habit. No, she said. I'm not. And I'm glad you caught yourself. I'm learning that, he said, same as I'm learning most things lately, later than I'd like. And she believed him, standing there in the cold with the smell of cattle and rail smoke around them, more than she'd believed anyone in longer than she wanted to count. Winter passed quiet between them. The kind of quiet that isn't empty. Shared meals some evenings when the chores lined up that way. His fence checked without her asking and hers checking his in return. Comanche moving between the two properties like the boundary had stopped meaning much to him weeks before it stopped meaning much to either of them. By February, Doris at the Mercantile had stopped bothering to pretend she wasn't watching the road between the two ranches, and had said as much to Reverend Hale after Sunday service, who had allowed only that time would tell, which Doris took as agreement. Spring brought calving, and Clara had a dozen cows due, and the memory of the two calves she'd lost the previous year to cold and exhaustion because there had been one pair of hands trying to be in two places, checking one corner of the barn while trouble found her in another. Wade showed up at her fence the first morning of the season without being asked, the way he'd shown up for most things by now. I'll take the midnight rounds, he said. You take the early ones. You know this herd better than anyone alive, so you take the hours when reading them matters most. I'll take the hours that are just cold and dark and don't need a particular gift, only a particular stubbornness, which I've got plenty of. Wade? I know, he said, before she could tell him she wasn't asking for rescue, hadn't asked it all this time. Equal split. That's not charity. That's sense, same as the cattle drive was sense. The worst night came in the third week. The temperature dropping hard after midnight and the wind coming off the bighorns with no warning at all. The kind of cold that got into the barn through gaps she'd have sworn weren't there in daylight. Wade found a first calf heifer down in the south corner. The calf turned wrong, breech entangled. And he came for Clara not because he couldn't manage alone. He delivered enough calves in 2 years to know the basics, but because she knew this particular animal and he didn't. And because a trail outside Larkspur had taught him what it cost to make decisions for people who hadn't asked him to make them. She dropped into the straw beside him without a word, her knowledge, his strength. Both of them moving in the rhythm two people find when they've worked alongside each other long enough to stop needing to talk about it. Hands finding the right places without instruction, the lantern throwing their shadows long against the barn wall. When the calf came sliding into the straw at last and lifted its head with the indignant fury of the newly born, wet and furious and entirely alive, Clara sat back against the barn wall and laughed. The kind of laugh that only comes when something hard has ended well, and the fear underneath it has nowhere left to go but out. Wade sat beside her in the straw, breathing hard, the heifer already turning to clean the calf with the fierce attention of new mothers everywhere. His shoulder found hers in the narrow space, and neither of them moved away from it. Comanche, in the far stall, turned his head and watched them with the settled attention of an animal who had been present for the whole of this, the storm, the drive, the long winter, and found the current arrangement entirely satisfactory, as though he'd been waiting on the two of them to catch up to something he'd already worked out for himself. Wade, what did you decide? Back when you first came up here, whether it was putting something down or picking something up. He was quiet for a moment. The calf made a sound. The heifer answered it, low and reassuring. Both, he said finally. I think it was both. Didn't know that when I bought the land. Know it now. Yes, she said. I think so too. I didn't know it either, back when a fence came down and I went chasing a horse into a storm. He took her hand in the straw, careful, like he'd handed her the reins that morning in the round pen. Outside, the wind kept doing what Wyoming wind does in March, relentless and indifferent, and inside the barn, warm and low-lit and smelling of hay and new life, everything was exactly as it should be, for the first time in longer than she could easily reckon. He asked her on a Saturday morning in April, on the porch before the day's chores, with Comanche standing loose in the yard between their two properties. Having long since decided the fence line was a suggestion that didn't apply to him, and hadn't for months. I want to say something, Wade said, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands like he needed something to do with them. "All right," she said, and waited, because she'd learned by now that he got to things in his own time, and rushing him only slowed him further. "I came up here to stop being the man I was in Texas," he said finally. Not because he was a bad man, particularly. Because he'd run out of reasons to keep going, and I didn't much like who I was becoming without any. He looked at the mountains, gone soft and blue in the early light. I didn't expect to find new reasons here. A half-wild horse I got asked to ride decided where he wanted to live somewhere around the 4th week. And I found I didn't much want to argue with him about it, and I've been finding I don't want to argue with a good many things since. He set down his coffee cup. "Clara, I'm not an easy man. I go quiet when I ought to talk. And I fix things without asking whether you wanted them fixed. And I've got a horse. Our horse, I suppose. By now, with no respect at all for property lines. But I'd like to court you properly, if you'll let me. Not the way we've been doing it these 7 months, without either of us calling it by its name." She looked at this man who had pulled her horse out of barbed wire in a storm, spent 6 weeks teaching a wounded animal to trust a rider again, ridden the front of a spooked herd beside her instead of ahead of her, taken the midnight calving rounds without being asked twice, and told her the truest things anyone had said to her in 2 years, one hard confession at a time. "Wade Calloway," she said, "you've been courting me since the night you pulled Comanche out of that wire. I just don't believe either of us had the sense to call it that until just now. I wasn't certain you'd noticed, if I'm honest. I've never been much good at announcing things. I noticed." She glanced at the horse in the yard, ears swiveled toward them both like he was following the conversation. "So did he. He stopped trying to get back to his old paddock the week after you first sat on him. Stopped needing the fence to keep him anywhere at all. He decided he lived here, same as you did, only he worked it out faster than either of us." Wade looked at his boots, then at her, and the almost smile arrived, all the way this time, the full one. The one that changed something in his whole face rather than just the corner of his mouth. "Then I'm asking properly." "Yes," she said simply, the way she said everything that mattered, no dressing it up, same as she'd asked him to ride the horse 7 months before. They married in June at the Larkspur Church. The whole county there, because the whole county had been watching since the October storm. Some of them since the night word got around a stranger had pulled Clara Bennett's horse out of his own fence wire in a thunderstorm, and nobody intended to miss the end of it. Doris sat in the front pew with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had finally been confirmed after months of patient, thorough surveillance. Clara wore blue. Wade wore a coat that fit him poorly through the shoulders and bore the discomfort of it without complaint. A man more at ease in work clothes, willing to suffer for the occasion. Comanche stood tied outside through the whole ceremony in a bit of ribbon Doris had insisted on, and when Clara came through the church doors afterward, he turned his head toward her the way he always did now, unhurried and certain, and she crossed to him first, before anyone else, and put her hand on his neck, and he went still under her touch the way he'd learned to in a round pen the autumn before. Wade came and stood beside them both, watching. "Your horse," she said. "Our horse," he answered, the way he'd been saying it for months now without either of them remarking on when the word had changed. She looked at Comanche, then at her husband, and smiled, something settling into place that had been building since a storm 1 year before. "The real one," she said. "Him." Reverend Hale, passing behind them on his way to the churchyard, said quietly to Doris, "Well, Mrs. Calloway looks settled." Doris said, "I knew it in October, when that horse of his came through her fence." "We all knew it in October, Doris." "Yes," Doris allowed, "but I knew it first." They joined the 2 properties that summer, 380 acres run as one operation. The shared fence line redrawn not as a boundary but as a working lane between 2 barns and 2 sets of pasture that made better sense combined than divided. Wade's rail contacts opened markets neither of them could have reached alone. Clara's years on that particular stretch of Wyoming ground meant they lost nothing to conditions that caught out ranchers newer to it. By the 2nd year, the operation turned a profit that made Silas Crane's $160 look like exactly what it had been all along. A small, frightening debt that had felt enormous in July and had led, by a path neither of them could have plotted from the start of it, to everything good that came after: the horse, the drive, the barn at midnight, the porch in April. One evening that second summer, sitting on the porch as the light went long and gold over the bighorns, Comanche grazing loose in the yard where he'd grazed most evenings for 2 years now, Wade said without looking up from his coffee. North fence, third post from the corner. Sitting 2 degrees off since March. I've been waiting to see if you'd noticed before I said anything. I noticed in April, Clara said. I was waiting to see if you'd admit you'd left it standing crooked on purpose, just to see how long it'd take me. He looked at her, and the almost smile arrived, all the way this time, the one she'd been watching for since a storm 2 years back, and had learned, over 2 years of evenings like this one, exactly how to earn. Saturday, he said. We'll fix it Saturday.
Yes, she said.
We will. He took her hand as the evening came down, Comanche lifting his head from the yard to watch them the way he always did, as though checking that the two of them were still where he'd left them. The mountains sliding from gold to amber to the deep blue of a sky that has never once needed permission to be beautiful. Over land that had needed, in its own quiet way, exactly the two people now sitting on that porch to hold it. A storm broke a corral rail on a Monday night, and Clara Bennett went out into the dark after a horse nobody could touch, and found a stranger already crouched beside him with a steady hand and a steadier voice. Weeks later, she stood at a fence line at dusk and asked him plainly to ride the one animal she couldn't reach on her own. And in asking, she found she'd asked for a great deal more than that, and gotten it slowly over 6 patient weeks in a year that followed them. That's the whole of it, really. She didn't need saving, and he was wise enough, most days, to know the difference between saving somebody and standing beside them. She needed someone who understood the difference between breaking a thing and earning its trust, and who was willing to spend 6 slow evenings in a round pen proving which one he meant to do, and then a year proving it again in every other way a person can. That kind of love doesn't announce itself with thunder, whatever the storm that opens the story might suggest. It just shows up in a round pen at dusk, session after session, until the thing that used to flinch stops flinching, and stays, and one day stops needing the fence at all. May God keep each of you who's listened this far. Until next time, keep writing.